Hello and welcome. Thank you very much for tuning in. I really appreciate it. This is a special presentation on Screencast-O-Matic to help brief you on more information pertaining to paternalism in slavery in America. Before we get started, please let me encourage you to use your primary docs in the DBQ set as a blueprint or a guide to help you, of course, weave in parts of this lecture presentation to your greater collective good enough understanding for slavery in the early 1800s in America. Another thing I want to point out here before I get started, you're welcome to take notes on this presentation. Should you need to replay any part of this for later, you're more than welcome to do so. But this is more information pertaining to what paternalism actually is and what the slave system was actually like in early America. Now keep in mind here that slavery undergoes different sets of stages of transformation, if you will, from, of course, even before the Revolution all the way up to the Civil War. But understanding this pivotal era of the early 1800s or the antebellum era is just as important as anything in understanding the dynamic institution of slavery. So let's go ahead and get started. So basically, the South is a divided society, and it becomes even more divided after the Nat Turner Slave Rebellion or Slave Uprising in 1831, which we're going to learn about in class. There were new laws that were passed which restricted slaves and their freedom, and of course they basically said that they must have white supervision at all times. And there were, of course, harsh laws imposed on them so that they could not read or write. One of the things I think is most interesting is that different types of slave societies had different types of rules, sometimes written and sometimes unwritten, that were embellished in society. A slave's daily life and labor was anything but easy. In fact, 90% of slaves lived on plantations or farms as America is coming towards the Civil War. Most slaves on cotton plantations worked from sunup to sundown 6 days a week, with 1 day off if they were lucky. But about 75% of slaves were field workers, and about 5% worked in industry. Now, urban slaves did have more autonomy than rural slaves, and it may not come to much of a surprise if you read Fraser real closely, you understood that there was a difference in the cultural landscape and, of course, the amount of freedoms that they had to really just kind of expand outward in this way. Now, additionally, when it came time for slave families and kinship and community, slaves did develop that, but of course under different circumstances. So normal family life was difficult for slaves. Fathers cannot always protect their children, and families were vulnerable to breakup by masters, and of course slave auctioning, as they became more common in American society, of course split up families accordingly. Now, most, of course, were reared in strong two-parent families. However, extended families provided nurturing support amid the horrors of slavery too in America. The family unit itself kept slavery from becoming demoralizing to its core and provided a sense of community as well. In fact, slave families on large-scale plantations were able to develop bigger bonds than probably what you might imagine. When it came time for religion, however, African Americans began to leave their mark on religion in its own way in America. Religion was the cornerstone of an emerging African American culture. Whites fear religion's subversive potential to try to supervise churches and preaching as well. I think one of the main reasons why religion was a threat to people during this time is because, of course, it really taught about equality and the alleviation of sin, and, of course, embracing of salvation and turning to Christ and the good deeds of Jesus. And so I think one can't help but to wonder, was religion really undermining the white oppressors' rules of rigid social hierarchy in the slave system? Now, the slave religion was kept secret from whites, but it reaffirmed the inherent joy for life, and in a sense it provided the perfect inspiration for them despite these trying times. The sermons themselves preached about the inevitable day of liberation for slaves too, which of course I'm sure was a big rallying point for their sentiments in Christianity. Now, most slaves did not rebel or run off, this is true, and most slaves expressed discontent through passive resistance as well. Sometimes work-related, for example, they would systematically slow down the work process, or they would sabotage the crop output or the plantation. They would even poison masters too. And of course, the cultural aspect of this is that this created a common consensus culture amongst slaves through stories and songs asserting equality. Another thing that I think is really interesting here is that slave rebellions were not just exclusive to Nat Turner's slave rebellion in 1831, but in other places around the country as well. If you can imagine how slave rebellions really did have an adverse effect for the white overseers and the white plantation owners to further clamp down on slaves, it would make sense given the horrors committed by them in this way Of course, some would say justifiably so. Now, free blacks in the Old South, of course, had a different experience as well. You see, Southern free blacks severely restricted in this way, as far as, both legal and cultural laws, but they were still treated as outcasts. Their sense of solidarity with slaves was quite interesting when you look at the relationship that they were able to foster with them, but they were generally unable to help them in many ways. Now, repression increased as time passed on and got closer to the American Civil War, but by 1860, some state legislators were proposing laws to force free blacks to emigrate or be enslaved altogether. Keep in mind it would be other laws like the Fugitive Slave Law that would, of course, cause problems for this as well. Let's talk about white society in antebellum South. So only a small percentage of slave owners lived in aristocratic mansions. In fact, less than 1% of the white population owned 50 or more slaves. So I think it's really important to dispel any fiction where when you think about the pre-Civil War South, we often think that, everyone must have lived in a beautiful white mansion with wraparound porches and large plantations, but that's clearly not the case here. Most Southern whites were yeoman farmers, and only 25%, a quarter of people in South, owned slaves at all. So the social prestige of slavery was determined by ownership of slaves as well. So there was something to be said about the social strata and elevation of status with slave ownership too. Now, what was the planters' world like? Well, big planters set the tone and had great influence over most aspects of Southern life. The planter wealth was based on commerce, land speculation, slave trading, and cotton planting. And so there tends to be this notion of a common cotton culture, which is embellished and established into the American slave system and, of course, the American South. Plantations managed as businesses. In fact, some would say that they even managed as large-scale corporations for their time. Most planters themselves were self-made men with good business models and good accounting practices to become financially able and secure. But they did, of course, embody romantic ideals imitated only by the richest. And when we think about the Southern way of life, some of these ideals are further embodied by these people. Now, when it comes to the issue of paternalism, keep in mind that planters prided themselves on paternalism, and they used this as one of their pro-slavery arguments for the justification of the institution. They said that if they took care of their slaves, they would provide better living standard for their Southern slaves than others in the Western Hemisphere who were free. They provided relatively decent treatment, at least they said, due in part to their increasing economic value after 1808. The planters knew that it was rather expensive to keep retraining and, of course, bringing in new workforces, so there wasn't a need to actually abuse and use every slave to their core. Now, planters actually dealt little with slaves themselves. Slaves were managed more intimately by overseers, and there was violent coercion sometimes, of course, by the overseers to the slaves in this way for the plantation to run and function. When it came time to understanding more small slaveholders here, slave conditions were obviously the worst with fewer than 20 slaves, but slaves shared the master's poverty too. Slaves were at the complete mercy of their master, and in many ways they had interesting relationships with them. Masters often worked alongside the slaves on the smaller scale farms or plantations, and most slaves would have preferred the economic and cultural stability of the large-scale plantation. But don't get me wrong, there are, of course, some disadvantages with that too. And looking at the culture of the yeoman farmers of the South, we can understand here that small farmers resented the large planters, but tolerated slavery too. Some aspired to be of the planter elite status, although many saw slavery as a guaranteeing their own liberty and independence. And slavery, of course, was viewed as a system for keeping blacks, quote, in their place, end quote. The farmers, of course, were proud to be self-reliant and, of course, embodied this culture that was the Southern farmer. And, of course, they often lived in what was called the backcountry, away from transportation and often disconnected from the modern world of that time. A closed mind and a closed society. So planters feared the growth of abolitionism as the American Civil War would get closer, but planters encouraged the closing of ranks and a rigid society. Slavery was often defended as a positive good, you see. Africans were depicted as inferior and children needing supervision. Slavery defended heavily by many anti-abolition people with the use of the Bible and Christianity. In fact, if you read the Bible closely, slavery is mentioned in many different ways, and some would allude to the fact that maybe God wanted slavery in his world. Slavery was also deemed to be a humane asylum to improve Africans and their lot in life, and slavery was superior to the northern wage labor, of course, system that was put in place. And many people, of course, would understand here that the pro-slave argument did have legitimacy for people in the time. Now, even though, of course, these points of hypocrisy are quite evident by people who advocated freedom and a better day and a better society, but still wanted slavery, it is quite interesting. When it comes to slavery in the Southern economy here, we should know that white Southerners perceive their economic interests to be tied to slavery too. Slavery would not have lasted as long as it did in America, except for the place that it held Southern economy together. In the Lower South, for example, the slave plantation society was a staple for their identity, but in the Upper South, farming and slave trading in this way was more part of their experience with the institution. When it comes to the internal slave trade here, mixed farming in Virginia and Maryland needed less labor, but they provided more capital. In the Upper South, they sold slaves to Lower South states. Virginia, Maryland, and Kentucky, for example, took on characteristics of industrializing the North and agricultural diversification, but the sectional loyalty of the Upper South was somewhat uncertain, and this, of course, would combine to form somewhat of a problem for them in the Civil War. Let's take a moment to look at this map here about slave concentration in 1820. As you can see here by this map, we can understand a little bit more about the slave dynamics for this time. Looking at the clustering of slaves in certain regions gives us better foresight and insight over to the types of common culture that proved to form to be a staple of that part of the region of the United States. We shouldn't sell short here the essence of cotton and how it became king in the South either. Even though it was a short staple, cotton drove the boom in the early 1800s. The cotton gin especially made the seed extraction quite easy. Intensive year-round requirements suited to slave labor, it's true that cotton was one of the hardest crops to cultivate. Although as cotton production moved westward, so too did the institution of slavery itself in these prospective places. The planters worked the land until it was totally depleted. Large planters dominated cotton production for many, many years, and in 1850 the South produced 75% of the world's cotton in full. Cotton was most important, of course, to U.S. businesses in this way, and to textile making as well. Now, slave concentration, of course, begins to shift here as we loom closer and closer to the American Civil War. But keep in mind, the straw that broke the camel's back, some people would say, is in fact the fugitive slave law that would give us, of course, a notion that the Civil War was inevitable later on. The reason why I think slavery might have been truly growing at the rapid pace that it was in the early 1800s is because Southerners resented their dependence on the Northern industry for commerce. But Southerners projected, of course, this different type of schema for their success. Some proposed using free white labor, this is true, although others proposed the use of slaves exclusively. The slaves who worked in Southern factories were present, but of course, more is known about the slave experience on the plantation. High cotton profits were discouraged to shift to industry to the South, and in this way, the South was exclusive in many ways to just the cotton kingdom of the South, which made them somewhat of a one-trick pony. There's also this issue of profitability as well. Slavery was not really profitable for the South as a whole, and white small farmers had lower living standards than most northern farmers, and envy began to reach a fever pitch and a boiling point. Profits from cotton were not well distributed, and the slave system resulted in a waste of human resources and southern undevelopment. And even before the Civil War, it would seem that there was this unequal notion of culture and society. Now, although these separate southern worlds between planters, slaves, less affluent whites, and free blacks began to grow, the fact is that these people together, held and bound by paternalism and the culture of the plantation economy, would build and expand on these customary relationships up to, and so I would say through, the American Civil War. So there you guys have it. In a nutshell, those are some of the key talking points that I would love for you to remember when it comes to identifying and describing paternalism. Please use this as a backdrop or a framework in identifying and explaining a little bit more about the slave experience in this way. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope you found this to be a tremendous help.